Welcome to our webinar, and I just want to say thank you to the other panelists. I'm joined today by longtime allies or co-conspirators in the fight to abolish DHS and the harmful, racist, and criminalizing logics that it thrives under. I'm joined by Jacinta Gonzalez, who's the Policy Director of Mijente, who's organized in the immigrant rights movement for over 15 years, focusing on the criminalization of migration, deportation defense, and ICE's use of tech and data. And Jacinta leads Mijente's No Tech for ICE campaign. Welcome, Jacinta. I'm also joined by Paromita Shah, who's the Executive Director of Just Futures Law. And for over 20 years, Paromita has specialized in strategies to combat immigration detention, enforcement, and criminalization, and previously served as the Associate Director at the National Immigration Project. I cut this part of your bio off of the NIPNLG. Sorry, you guys, it's been a long year. Okay, and then I am Mizue Aizeki. I'm the founder and executive director of the Surveillance Resistance Lab, and I spent almost 20 years working to organize to end the injustices at the intersections of the criminal and migration control systems, including criminalization, imprisonment, and exile. So just a little bit more about us and what we've worked on together. Many of us have done many different things and individually and together, but I just wanted to highlight a few things that we've worked on together. One is the Who's Behind ICE report that came out during Trump, the tech and data fueling deportations. And we followed up with a report called Heart Attack on DHS's massive biometrics database. And then each of us shows up in part in the anthology that I co-edited, Resisting Borders and Technologies of Violence, highlighting our organizing work there. So just to put us into the context of mass deportation after DHS, each one of us started working on these issues during the ascendancy of a massive a regime, a border policing and massive detention and deportation regime, which was unprecedented in US history. And since then, it's become a very normalized feature of the political landscape, both materially and also like the narratives that surround it. And so just to remind ourselves about this context, before DHS was founded, the United States, in the recorded history of deportations, achieved about 2.6 million deportations, right? And you can see with each presidency, Obama being the high point, how that number has reached over, in the millions since then. I think Biden right now is at about 1.1 million. And why we are here today talking about mass raids is because we've all heard about the intentions of mass deportations and border policing put out by Stephen Miller, Trump's advisor, Trump, the candidate, and also in Project 2025. And also Harris has been campaigning to show that she's as tough on immigration as the Republicans are. And so we're going to spend the next hour sharing about our work on these issues to provide some lessons on how to approach what we know is going to be coming, regardless of who is the next president. And so given the time constraints, we're just going to focus on mass raids. I don't want to minimize the harm of the smaller raids operations that happen continually under ICE, but there's something particular about ICE mass raids that we just wanted to spend some time on today. And so Operation Crosscheck, we will talk about that, but just to note, this is one they started regularizing, normalizing of the frequent mass raids that would happen in cities across. We're also going to talk about Operation Mega, which was threatened to be the biggest mass raid in history, as well as Operation Palladium, which was an expanded Operation Crosscheck where they were threatening to bring in the Border Patrol, or they did bring in the Border Patrol to cities like New York right before COVID hit in 2020. So oops, that's it for this piece of the presentation. So we're gonna start with Jacinta. If you could introduce yourself very quickly with a brief story on when you started fighting against ICE policing, and yeah, take it from there.
Sure. Well, hi everyone, and thank you so much, Mizue and Surveillance Resistance Lab for helping bring us together to have this webinar. I feel like we've been talking about it for a minute, but I actually feel like as much as we were postponing it, now is the right moment to be having this conversation, given what we're seeing as part of the conversation around and the debates around the national election for the next president of the U.S. As you are so good at reminding us, I started doing this work a very long time ago under the Bush administration, when I was organizing day laborers and reconstruction workers and undocumented families in New Orleans after Hurricane Katrina. And I didn't start off with the intention of organizing against, deportations, against immigration enforcement. I started off organizing around wage theft. And it became really clear pretty soon into organizing that you actually couldn't organize day laborers against wage theft without addressing policing and without addressing immigration enforcement, because that was the reason why people weren't talking about what was happening to them, because the employers would call the police as soon as they entered the jail. The immigration would pick them up. And so we started to understand how these things were connected pretty early on. I used to still have my to-do list from like 2018 or something, where it would say like, find out what a detainer is, because it kept coming up in conversations. And I actually think that's when I met both of y'all. But that led us to doing a lot of campaigns against collaboration or collusion between our local sheriff and immigration. And we were able to win one of the first detainer policies against detainers in the South. But as a consequence of that, we started to see ICE start to go into communities more and more. And that's when we started to see ICE raids, where they would have mobile biometric devices outside of grocery stores, in our neighborhoods, at laundromats. They were even going into Bible study groups. Like, they were really kind of going all in on their strategy. And I think that's kind of led us down this path of understanding a little bit more the tech and data that they use on those raids, and how all of these things are connected. So that's kind of how I came to all of this, Paromita. But I know you started even earlier. You really got into the Bush years. So can you tell us about how you got started?
Hey, and also echoing my thanks to Surveillance Resistance Lab and Mijente for, always being amazing advocates in the space around enforcement and this new frontier of policing. Um, yeah, I mean, I feel like my career really started with the birth of DHS in 2005. I was practicing immigration law in the late 1990s and doing asylum work and VAWA work, TPS. And there were a number of political things happening, but it wasn't until 9/11, which really shaped the kind of the national security underpinnings of this agency and its desire to put itself forward as an agency that was going to protect the United States from terrorism, from criminals, that, I really began to be interested in this because while I was working at detention projects, it was clear, that what the agency was saying and their rhetoric around detention and enforcement and crime it was really meant to bolster detentions and deportations. So, um, you know, I think the first raid that I began, I think, working on was the Swift raids under the Bush era in 2006. And that was when 1,300 people were rounded up at 6 plants. They were accused of identity theft. They were accused of all these other immigration violations. And it was so massive and so swift and so coordinated that really we were taken aback that, about 8 months later, there were the New Bedford raids in Massachusetts. And the New Bedford raids were also horrible, where 300 people were arrested in the kind of like this freezing cold of Massachusetts. And they raided a factory, using what, was called I-9 audits, which is, a system where ICE was then trying to use the employment system kind of in the way that Jacinta was talking about, targeting workers to get at massive raids. But the one that, really stuck with me was the Postville raids. And that was also kind of like the last one in the Bush era where we got to look at the warrants, but it was the force of the agency, now that it was about 5 years old, helicopters armed with people and SWAT teams, 900, agents to arrest 300 people, families being separated. It was absolute terror on the ground. And I think it was there that we realized that the agency really saw itself and was acting like a paramilitary force. And that's really kind of what got me into this idea of policing, and getting more interested about what is the connection between police, ICE, and enforcement in our cities, and in our and in detention centers. So that's kind of like a little bit about how I started. But I guess with that, it launched me into a number of campaigns with all of the folks on this call around detainer campaigns as well. But I'd love to now kind of like move it over to Mizue to talk about ICE raids. I got into it in Bush, and right after that, it's really set it up for Obama. So we'd love to hear you talk about that, Mizue.
Thanks, Paromita. I think you've set it up really well. When you were talking about ICE as a paramilitary force, like I just think it's important to remind ourselves when DHS was founded, there was no ICE police, right? And they started with setting up these groups called the FUJOPS teams, fugitive operations. And I think it was one of the fastest growing parts of ICE in the early days of ICE coming into existence. And this acceleration of the criminalization of immigrants, Paramita talked about how at the Swift raids, they not just only arrested people for being in the country without authorization, then they started to charge people with fraud. And so like all the stuff for each administration, you see how like it's just a building of the apparatus, the actual number of cops, but also like the logics that they kept building. And one of the most remarkable features of Obama, who inherited DHS from George Bush, who founded it, was he took something that was framed as a national security focused agency and turned it into what they started to call an agency that focuses on public safety, right? And the way that they were going to address public safety was by targeting immigrants with criminal convictions in large scale. So, when we talk about the detainer policies, we have to remember that before DHS, even before Obama, there was no automatic way for police to share fingerprints with ICE, right? That happened under the so-called Secure Communities program, starting to roll out in 2009, but really taking like full force in 2010 to 2013. And for anyone organizing in that time, it was really a wild time, right? Because all of a sudden, anyone who was getting arrested who was not a citizen was almost automatically getting turned over or notified. ICE was getting notified about them. That was happening. But at the same time, Obama administration, as Democrats really trying to fight for some kind of comprehensive immigration reform, really leaned into this idea of who's a good immigrant and who's a bad immigrant, right? And part of that was this really incredible prosecutorial discretion memo that they created, right? That was around that time where they created categories of people who were targets for deportation based on their immigration status and their criminal convictions, right? And so cross-check was well, the first Operation Cross-Check, which is a mass raid, was in 2011. This was during Obama times where we were all fighting for detainer policy campaigns. Some of them had already passed, some of them we were trying to get them better, but it was because the detainer policies, which limited, police ability to turn people over to ICE, started to mess up some of that flow. The ICE raids really picked up, right? And Operation Crosscheck is a operation where each field office, let's say you're part of in New York, you get officers from other cities, other field offices to join you in a particular place. So they'll all descend on Chicago, they'll all descend on New York, whatever it is. And then they will try to arrest as many people as they can at that time. Sometimes they get help from Homeland Security investigations, so other uh, police officers that aren't part of the actual detention deportation part of ICE. And the thing that they would do was they had to actively construct the threat that people with criminal convictions created. So they would have these press conferences, right? When they would descend on a city and they would start talking about things like, we are challenging recidivism, we are targeting like the worst of the worst. And I think part of what the challenge was, and then they started saying that ICE exists to protect public safety. And I think one of the lessons from the time was that, a lot of the advocates in trying to protect people from deportation started to like lean in on ISIS, like you're actually not targeting the worst of the worst, right? Like you're actually targeting a lot of people who fall into your third tier category of priority. And so it was a really important piece of the work that we did in protecting people while we were protecting individuals from deportation directly, also really pushing back on this narrative, right? That some people are more deserving of deportation than others. And then also this merger of kind of these logics of like the prison industrial complex onto the immigration system. And that's still a lot of the work that we continue to do today, but it's a really important history, I think, to grapple with as we look to what might be coming next. So that was Obama time. There's so much more to say. But I'm going to pass it on to Jacinta to talk a little bit about what it was like then in 2017 when the Trump administration started, and some of the key attacks that we faced there, in addition to talking about Operation Mega.
Oh yeah. Do we really have to remember Trump won? Because I mean, I think a lot of folks who are watching and listening probably have their own like recollections of some of the things that were coming up. I think we have, like you were saying, Mizue, always been fighting against this idea of like who's deserving, who's non-deserving, and particularly the way that any contact with police or any contact with the criminal legal system sort of makes you a priority in their eyes. I think the thing that was also really hard when Trump came in the first time was that all of that was out the window, right? So that it really was a complete open. So like all of the arguments, as flawed as they are, at least gave you organizing tools to be able to organize to fight deportations. And I think one of the first things that Trump did when he came in was say, actually, there is no discretion. Everybody's game. And I think that was both important in terms of cases and who was confronting deportation, but also the fear in community, right? In terms of feeling like, one, are they going to come for you? And two, if you did, what would be the organizing tools that you would have at your disposal to be able to fight back? The second thing he did that was really, really aggressive was really go after the organizing, right? So cities that had created policies, whether they call them sanctuary or not, around detainers, around police and ICE information sharing and all of these things, they were the first to be under attack in terms of the threats of these raids. And the third thing that I would say that was really, really important to just kind of name is the acceleration of the use of prosecutions in the Department of Justice in addition to the deportation system, right? And so that meant that, folks who were trying to cross the border and were getting all sorts of charges in terms of trafficking charges or whatever it is, because they were bringing their cousin over, that just this weaponization of prosecutions against immigrants was intensified. We started to see it in the use of 1325 and 1326, right? Illegal entry and reentry. And you started to see those charges also be used to justify using more surveillance, right? So I remember talking to you around someone who had been deported and come back, and there was like a drone that was like surveilling their house, right? And we're like, how the fuck did they get that? And so the warrants were coming through a lot of these criminal prosecutions. I think you also could see that really clearly with that huge raid in Mississippi with all of those workers who were picked up. It was tragic. It was more than 700 people. I particularly remember the case of Maria, who was deported even though she was breastfeeding her young child, and permanently separated from her 3 kids. But part of the evidence in that case was the use of the ankle shackle GPS, right? Showing that folks were going from their home to their work location. So you also saw, as you're saying, sort of the layering of the ankle shackle system being used as evidence in a criminal prosecution before people were being deported, and sort of seeing that escalation of all of the things that happened. And I think it's important to remember this because I've been around some circles where, unfortunately, like, because the rhetoric is so awful, that sometimes if he doesn't get to that point where he like deports 11 million, people kind of justify it. Like, it was all fluff. It was like, no, actually there was a lot of harm done, and there was an intensification of the policies and the violence that communities were facing. So, I think it's just kind of important to remember some of those horrors, because I think, again, I've seen people now going to the rallies and saying, oh, this mass deportation thing, it's just the slogan. He's just trying to scare people. But no, there are actual policies behind what he's trying to present. And they're really, really harmful. And we have to do everything we can to stop them.
Thanks, Jacinta. Paromita, can you just mention a little bit about the threat of Operation Mega?
Yeah, I mean, I was in the room. I remember sitting with, I think, both of you when we were talking about what to do when we heard Trump talking about what was going to be Operation Mega. And, the request to us was to file FOIAs, not only of ICE in headquarters, but all the 24 field offices. And we got back, ironically, their plans, which are available. And you can actually see how many of these plans go into such great detail about how they want to conduct a raid. So this one was geared to arrest 8,400 to 10,000 people in one day, right? They were going to use all 24 field offices. And in the leak that came out, they were planning to create a list, which was, through what they call the national, it's called the NCATC, which is the National Criminal Alien Targeting Center, which is a center within DHS that basically creates a list of everyone they want to deport. And so they were just making lists of people, sending them out to their local field offices, and then asking them, the field offices, to make sure by looking at their utility records, by looking at their cell phone records, by tracking them in different ways, whether they were going to be able to be arrested, locally in the place that they were. And, there's the regular disgust you have in how excited the agents were to run this operation. It was, wow, I can read you one. They said, yes, they sent out a broadcast and it's been changed the name. They changed the name to Epic. It was trumped, or let's go, happy hunting. And it was really chilling to see that the kinds of tools that people had in their possession, the willingness to use the tools, the excitement that they had in making this list. It was clear that they had quotas to reach, that Palantir at the time was involved in it, because they were creating kind of like the infrastructure to support it. That in all the plans that they had, they didn't care whether they were arresting targets or what they call collaterals, which is basically anyone around them. And that they were definitely, as Jacinta mentioned, planning to target them. So I feel like that was Operation Mega. It was unveiling how ICE runs these programs, and it was recycling Crosstrack, is recycling Safe Guardian, it was recycling a number of raids that they already had on the books to push it out. So I think what chilled me was like that these plans are kind of eternal, right? They don't really change. They're about huge lists, huge technologies that they can get, and then just the manpower to make it happen, and working in concert together.
Thanks, Paramita. It is really chilling if you think about it. And I remember they said it didn't happen because there was a hurricane, right? I think, and so I'm just going to tell another story that was also similarly horrifying that didn't happen because of a global pandemic, right? And so if you can, kind of drawing out a little bit, Jacinta, what you were saying about like, we gotta believe something terrible can happen because it's already it's happened over and over again and at different scales. But think about how much ice has grown since this time, and we can imagine what they have the capacity to do. So like in early 2020, Trump was really mad at New York. He was mad because they passed the green light law, which basically was like cutting off information from DMV being sent directly to ICE. He also was looking for the story, and you can tell this in the FOIAs, that was going to be able to blow up some kind of mass reason to do mass deportation. And what was happening in New York City, and you remember when he first became president, he had the executive order, which was very clearly targeting the so-called sanctuary cities, right? And so New York was a big one. And what it was like to be organizing against ICE in New York in January was mayhem. Like people, like I think the number of ICE raids like was like four times the usual rate. It was like so high. I shot a guy in the face, right, while they were conducting an arrest. And they were stopping people in their cars, and it was really horrifying. They had so I don't know guns very well, but they had those big guns that military people use, like out in the Bronx in the streets, walking through apartments, and we have all sorts of footage about this. And then in I think it was February, we got word that we started getting reports that Border Patrol agents were being seen around New York. And we were just like, what's that? And so, New York obviously is close enough to the Canadian border, and has, obvious the so yeah, we were just kind of confused on what Border Patrol is doing. But then we found out through the New York Times that actually they were recruited by ICE, ERO, the detention force, the deportation force of ICE, to support their actions. But it was, and then in February of 2020, I think it was Valentine's Day, we found out from the New York Times that they were calling in BORTAC, right, part of their SWAT team, the Border Patrol SWAT team, to support ICE in there. So, really what this was called Operation Palladium. It was really an overblown cross-check is what we found out through a FOIA. And I just should note that we are going to have another webinar on October 16th. I can share that information, where we're going to be talking about the FOIA findings from webinar, as well as Citizens Academy, where ICE tried to recruit people in Chicago to be part of their citizen police force. So, but I think part of what happened as Operation Palladium, and the story that it tells us, is that it's not hard at all for them to mobilize the Border Patrol to beef up their forces. And so if we think about ICE having now, I think ERO before the first Trump wanted to have like 3,500, right, employees, and then they can use Homeland Security investigations agents, and then the Border Patrol has like 20,000. Like if we think about the scale, and we think about how consolidated their missions have become as in their plans, like this is what I think part of the threat that we have to anticipate coming forward. So I just wanted to spend yes, so Paramita can offer some insights on the size of the ICE policing, but I think it's really just what we want to spend the rest of the time before we move to Q&A is just to reflect, Jacinta and Paramita, on like what some of the key lessons are for you both, having done this across 4 administrations, and what we can offer to the listeners there. So I'm going to start with Jacinta.
Ay, well, some of the lessons. Well, first I just want to start off by saying, like, I think some of the lessons are that, particularly given the political climate we're in and the the speeches that both candidates, both Harris and Trump have given, I actually think we should be prepared for like raids to speed up no matter who wins. That's a hard thing to say. It's a hard thing to like kind of wrap your head around. I'm not saying like there's uh ideas of what it's going to look like in either scenario, but I actually don't want us to be like kind of talking as if it's like in one scenario we're okay, in another scenario where we're looking at huge raids, because I do think that there's potential for upticks in enforcement and whoever takes, whoever the next president is. I think one of the things that to me has been a huge lesson, and part of the reason we've continued this area as the No Tech for ICE campaign has just been the importance of making sure that we can kind of close the data loopholes on a lot of our policies, because the way that cross-check and all of these things are happening, the way that they're getting people's addresses, the way that they're getting people's full names, the way they're finding out who else lives in the house, a lot of times is not information that's being shared by local cities. It's actually information that's being shared by your cable bill or your utilities or other sources like that. And so, we've been trying to push for Cook County here in Illinois to close the data loopholes of the detainer bill that exists. But I think that's work that we have to continue to do all across the country to be able to ensure that ICE has as little information as they can get to go after our loved ones. I think the second like kind of thing to sort of be looking at is that a lot of folks are going to be at risk, and that includes, like you were saying, Mizue, a lot of folks that have had past contact with the criminal legal system, even if it's like 10, 15 years ago. And so we have to be able to have those conversations. But I'm also worried about a lot of folks who have come in the last couple of years, right? Folks who have come into Chicago. I've been going to the day labor corners here in Chicago, talking to folks who have recently arrived from Venezuela, from Senegal. And a lot of folks haven't applied for asylum, haven't been able to do a change of venue, have been in a state of flux for a while, right? And so that just means that there's a lot of folks out there that might be targets for ICE, right? And so thinking about spaces where people are congregating, thinking about spaces where people are coming together as areas. The other lesson that to me is really important, and something that just kind of points to our organizing, is like, we need champions. We need folks, these like quote unquote sanctuary cities. They're not what they used to. It's not like the mayor of New York is going to stand up for us right now. I think there's a lot more space for the mayor of Chicago to continue to defend folks. So like, I actually do think that having folks that are elected to office be able to stand up for folks is a big deal, and can kind of create a barrier, can create a barrier of protection for our communities. And I think we continue to have to push to get champions that will actually be able to join our fights against these types of raids. And I think the fourth thing, just in terms of like lessons learned or where organizing has to go, is we can't forget about the Department of Justice. I do think that they continue to be talk about conspirators with DHS when they're doing these raids. And so I think that continuing to push everyone against like having the DOJ be an accomplice in this is really important. I was looking at numbers recently of prosecutions for folks who are crossing the border. They are up, right? I think as we're thinking about who's going to take the White House, like we have to continue to push to make sure that is no longer the case. And so I think there's just sort of a lot of places, like it's not something that we should just sort of be passively waiting for the raid to happen and then respond in terms of figuring out lawyers for everyone who was there. There are actually things that we can do in our organizing to create a barrier of defense against these types of large operations.
Thanks, Jacinta. Paromita, what's top of mind for you?
Maybe, I might just harken back like a little bit even before then, which is that, the technologies are really tricky, and that the organizing is really important to support. So like when I think about what needs to be funded and supported, it is the organizing, because it is the organizing that actually was able to find inroads into how to get, at the people who could influence local and national stakeholders to take a stand against a raid, to push against employers, but also to be champions. And I think that's super important. But I also think that like litigation that was tied with the organizing was also really important. And I am a little worried about it. Like, who is going to be doing the litigating, these days is something that I do worry about, because I think what came out of that era was organizers who knew how to use the law or understood the law to make kind of like surgical interventions, because they knew how the system works. So I feel like at this stage, it's really important for us not to make the demand only and see how it falls out. It is to understand, how is it working locally? Where are people being transferred to? Where are people being held? Do you actually know where the jail is? Do you know how to reach an ICE official? And I feel like all of that, when that became a little bit like second nature for so many organizers, it really did add momentum and power to the strength of the campaigns. And so I felt like there was a strong role for organizers and a strong role for lawyers who were interested in supporting that work, to make sure that we knew the navigation of those systems. And so everyone kind of at that point did do deportation 101. Everybody did know where their local office was. And because the interventions had to be made so quickly and precisely, at that point, because now the agency is just able to get information more quickly. There's just more holes within some of our sanctuary cities, and data protection will be a new frontier for fights, as we talk about raids. And so I think, I'm really interested in learning about how data protection is happening in these cities, and have been working on it for some time with my colleagues. But I do think they'll, data infiltration, data sharing, ICE using data, our everyday data against us, is something we're going to have to kind of get familiar with, but also develop strategies to fight back now.
Thank you, Paramita. I just want to add a few things to wrap up and then turn it over to Q&A. I think just to reinforce what Jacinta said about the DOJ, the Department of Justice, like one other thing that happens is that they start to join into these joint terrorism, it's not terrorism task force, sorry, these joint task forces with ICE. And so sometimes they'll conduct a raid in a city, and you'll have like every policing agency that could be there, right? So like if we can't get you for some other, deportation offense, then we'll just get you for illegal reentry, which is DOJ, right? If we don't get you for any of those things, then we'll try to see if we can get the NYPD to have some charge against you. And I think this is the thing, Paramita reminded me that like ICE, DHS has now more armed federal agents than the Department of Defense. And so, we're talking about a police force, an immigration police force that's larger than some militaries of other countries. I think it's bigger than Canada's, right? And so part of the thing about like when we think about how this has been able to happen is, there's a huge amount of money that's spent on DHS. And so like the budget has been an area that has been extremely difficult to crack, but it still is an important thing to try to figure out how can we start to downsize. I think that Project 2025 also has very scary ideas on how to downsize DHS, but part of what Paramita and I were talking the other day is like when we're thinking about what our fights are and what our demands are, like there's always going to be some kind of like the precision of the demand really matters, because there's going to be some negotiation that happens that ends up probably because they have so much power, right? Making sure, ensuring that a big group of people are going to be excluded from whatever the benefit is of whatever the action is. And so that's the thing that I think for us that continue to be a lesson is that, the carrot is very small and the stick is very large, meaning like every time any progress was made, it made it so much harder for another group of people that the system relies upon to continue to justify its existence. And it was almost always the people with criminal convictions, right? Or people who had crossed more recently, or Muslims, like they're pillars to the Department of Homeland Security's kind of primary mission. And I think we just have to be really sensitive that their hierarchies exist. They exist through laws. Some people have more legal rights than others. They exist through long-standing, like racialized ideas of who belongs and who doesn't belong. And I think that that's just going to be continue to be a continual fight, is to make sure that really both our words and our actions truly do lead for liberation, towards liberation for all, and not just within the boundary of what's called the United States, right? That there are global dimensions to this fight that we have to grapple with. So I think we are ready to move into some Q&A. So Chris, can you help us with that? Thank you.
Yeah, for sure. We do have a couple questions in the chat, and if you do have a question, make sure to put it in that Q&A box. One of the questions is, can you please say more about how ICE gets info from private companies and how to close those data loopholes? Thanks.
I'll take a first stab. You can take a second stab, Pato, as we're pointing the finger. So the thing about, and this is, I think Ms. in one of her first slides showed a report, the Who's Behind ICE report, that we all co-authored many, many years ago, that started to honestly unveil some of the stuff that I had no idea how it worked until we did the research to draft that report. But there's actually companies called data brokers that are dedicated to just buying and selling our information. A lot of times we think of those companies as companies that are just like figuring out what kind of shoes we like on Amazon so we get better ads. But turns out they're actually selling all sorts of information on us. And these two companies, Thomson Reuters and LexisNexis, actually have like a number for you. So you know your social security number or whatever your number is, but they have a number for you too. And they have these huge files where they amass all of this information, and they sell it. And they sell it to police departments and they sell it to ICE. So both Thomson Reuters and LexisNexis have had contracts with ICE to provide this type of information that then they use in when they do cross checks or whenever they're trying to figure out their target list for raids or other operations. And so we've been trying to use every strategy that we can to try to stop the flow of information from data brokers into the hands of ICE. It really is a way for them to get around needing a warrant. They just buy the information instead of actually having to get a warrant and go get it if they had an investigation of any sort. But you know, I think there's a couple of strategies that we've been looking into. The one that I was mentioning is trying to figure out, for example, many times there's actual state or city sources of information that are being sold to these data brokers. And so the idea is we need to cut that and stop that practice because, for example, that is many times the way that ICE will find out people's release times from jails or prisons. So I don't know if many of you may be from places where you have a sanctuary policy or where you have a detainer policy. And you're like, wait a minute, I thought the police wasn't supposed to share this information with ICE. They might not be sharing it directly, but if a data broker can buy it, they can give it to ICE. And that's how ICE shows up at your doorstep after you were released or after you paid bond. So part of what we've been trying to do is cut out those types of places of information. We've also worked with federal agencies to try to make sure some of this information is private and that people can't get access to it in this way, because we also know that it's used for doxing, it's used for intimidating people who are accessing healthcare, for example, abortions. So there's a lot of places where this is kind of where we need to continue to do work, but that's why we have to continue to push, because the data broker industry is growing and they're trying to get more and more information. And so we need to have accountability at all levels, from the federal level to make sure that they're actually having safe practices, to a local level where we're actually protecting the intentions behind our sanctuary bills.
Yeah, I don't think I have much more to add to that. ICE definitely knows that they're buying the data to get around the sanctuary provisions in their cities. And so it is a deliberate tactic to avoid all types of requirements under their laws, and also because it's easier to skirt a Fourth Amendment, search and seizure requirement. You don't need a warrant if you can just buy the data, right? So I think like if you were wanting to start, you can start looking at your, real crime or next generation crime center in your city, which are becoming ever more popular and more kind of like standard things in each city, where they think the tech is really what's going to do the policing these days. And so when you look at the contracts that they have, you'll see that they'll have them, through with LexisNexis, or their parent company Relics. And, you know, just to give you a sense of the scale of data brokers, they have 10,000 plus government and commercial sources that they're looking at. So it's a huge enterprise. It's a huge moneymaker. And there's ways to find those contracts in your cities and then cut them off.
And just last plug, in case folks that are watching or listening want to continue to do more research on this. If you go to the No Tech for ICE website under resources, you'll see a bunch of different reports that we've put out that kind of describe what's happening in Cook County, that describe, for example, what's happening in Colorado, because data brokers are also really involved in, for example, really the privatizing of police, right? The way that local law enforcement agencies are talking to each other sometimes is through the platforms owned by the data brokers. And so there's a bunch of things that are going there that we have to pay attention to. So there's a lot of reports, there's a lot of just breakdowns of the flow of information, and how it flows into ICE's general like tech and data landscape. So would really recommend people take a look at the No Tech for ICE website on the resource section, and you can learn more there. And if you're interested in kind of doing some specific research in your locality, let us know. We might be able to support on that. My email is jacinta@mijente.net. I'll put it in the chat as well. But feel free to just kind of reach out, and happy to support in that way too.
Thanks. Yeah, please look at the great resources that were shared by Jacinta and Paromita. I would just add one point to reinforce, Jacinta, on your lessons learned. I think, being in New York and seeing a mayor that's actively trying to undo the detainer policies, like, I think we have to be really clear that part of the reason why Obama achieved such high levels of deportation, and what was because of this information sharing and detainer compliance between police and ICE. That's just part of it. But just to not underestimate the threat, I think, of undoing those policies as well. It's just something to keep in mind, because it was definitely in the sights of Trump in the first administration. If whoever becomes president again, it was a long time ago, right? So when we passed a lot of those, it was almost a decade. And so like we've lost a lot of the city council people who were the ones that initially passed a lot of those laws, just because, it was a decade. And so it's just something really to keep in mind and think about.
Thanks, folks. There's another question that came through is, do you think a majority of migrant justice organizers are preparing for mass deportations regardless of the elections? What talking points or tactics have you found to be effective in helping people understand that both presidencies will be equally dangerous for migrant communities?
Deep sighs, deep sighs. The truth is, no, absolutely not. I don't think the majority of migrant justice organizers are preparing for mass deportations. I think one of the things that I have, one of the moments where my heart kind of dropped was when during the DNC when Vice President Harris was talking and talked about supporting the border security bill. And I think for a lot of folks that don't know what's in the bill, they're like, that sounds reasonable and like a good compromise. I think for us that have read the fine print, we're like, shit, this is really, really bad news. I think for not only because it's an investment in border policing, not only for the investment in surveillance, but it's total destruction of asylum in a lot of ways, making more people even more vulnerable to deportation, reinforcing this idea that we need to secure the border before we actually offer any sort of pathways to citizenship for other folks in the community. So I do think that there is, because of because of what's at stake at the election, that we also know what would happen if we had another round of Trump, that I think a lot of folks are not sort of focusing on that. But it has actually been a little bit of a relief to see that a lot of organizations are saying that they're going to continue to be against the border bill, that folks are continuing to speak out against that. And I think we just have to continue to really talk about that with communities. One of the things that I love about this crew that this webinar today is that like we will take it back to the Bush era if we have to. And I think folks just need to understand the history of this. This is not the first time that it's, if we give a little bit of enforcement, then maybe we'll get some sort of relief, right? Like that was Obama's strategy accordingly. Like if I am strong on deportations, then I'll be able to have comprehensive immigration reform. Turns out we got deportations and no reform. I think that's been the pattern. And so when I think about effective talking points for our people, I actually think it's history lessons. It's actually taking us down this path of understanding how the police to deportation pipeline was built, and why some of these narratives are coming up. Because whether it's dreamers versus their parents, or whether it's the good immigrant versus the criminal immigrant, or whether it's new arrivals versus people who have been here for 20 plus years, anytime we have some of those dichotomies that pit us against each other as a community, we're all going to lose. And so I think that's what actually gets people to effectively see that, yeah, we can continue to get out the vote against Trump because we know what's at stake, while still not, playing dumb to actually what is on the line for our community.
Thanks, Jacinta. I think we have time for one more question, Chris.
Yeah, this one kind of gets into a little bit more of like the proactive actions that we can be a part of. Someone asked, are there any recommendations on how we can use our sites of work, our education, our communities, etc., to go on the offensive to reverse these political policies and hold and/or challenge both Democrat or Republican controlled cities, counties, states, offices? So would y'all say are ways that we can be a little bit more proactive and go on the offensive in different areas?
I'll jump in again, but feel free to add stuff. I think one is, continuing the practice of like educating our communities around deportation, educating around how we can organize to stop deportations, and having folks make sure that they have their packets ready, right? We talk about really having defense toolkits. We have one as Mijente that we worked on with JFL and others, but actually having people prepared for a scenario where that could happen really goes a long way. And those conversations, sometimes people shy away from them because they think they're just going to be scaring people. But my experience has been that folks are already thinking about those worst case scenarios. And so actually giving people tools that they can actually use in moments of crisis helps people be much stronger, much more focused, and be ready to have some of those conversations. The other things I would say is, like, again, following up on your policy and following up with your elected officials. When raids happen, when these kind of things happen, you're going to need champions. And so whether that's your mayor or your congressperson or your senator or whoever it can be, actually talking to them and making sure that they understand that this is something that concerns you, that you're going to count on them if something happens to be able to help stand up for community members and make introductions. I can't tell you enough how many times like successful anti-deportation campaigns are because an elected actually knows the person, right? Like they've gone into their office and they've talked to them, or they've talked to their family member, they've talked to their kids, and they're like, oh shit, that's the fire under my butt that I need to actually go and take this fight to the next level. And so I think sometimes we forget that as advocates, and we go to the nonprofit meetings, but like community members have to be part of those spaces too, to actually be able to fight and demand what is needed. So those are just things that to me are important to be proactive. And then it's just, again, the having the defense plan. The Georgia Latino Alliance for Human Rights would talk about having ICE-free zones. And they literally, same way we're going door to door now to get out the vote, they were going door to door telling people how not to open the door if ICE came to their neighborhood, and what to do and why not to open the doors of your cars and not to open the doors of your homes, and what to do at your workplace. So that type of education and formation is really, really needed. And there's tons of tools for groups that have been doing that for a while. So look out for the deportation toolkit around how to use the current prosecutorial discretion memo to stop deportations. Look at the ICE-free toolkit that GLAR has and has been using. And also happy to talk through if there's particular concerns in your area. Like, different places look different, right? It's not the same to be in rural Arkansas than to be in the middle of Chicago when you're thinking about how to do these defense plans. And so there are things that are important to adjust. And again, happy to chat to any organizer who wants to talk more about how to do that.
I'll just add one thing, which is like, I think it's easy to think that a lawyer is going to be able to solve, I think, a deportation case. But it's really important for organizers and communities to understand the systems that are being deployed against them. And so it's so essential to understand these deportation defense toolkits so that you can ask the right questions, and also reach out to mentoring from places like Mijente or from other organizations like Surveillance Resistance Labs, so that you can know what the legal system can do, what is actually like, what are the deliverables, and where you can make interventions that can make the most difference. I think there are movement lawyers all over the country. I'm a movement lawyer. I know I'll be doing this work, but I think it's just really important to do exactly what Jacinta says, and to not only just rely on the legal system and a lawyer to solve this problem, to solve problems around deportations.
That's great. Thank you. And I think that's a very generous offer from an incredible organizer for, any to offer support on thinking this through. I would also just add to Paramita's point that it's important to recognize the limits of the legal system around immigration, but it's really important to recognize that when you have really smart, creative lawyers like Paramita, it opens up a possibility that doesn't exist for people. And so, in all the cases that I've won that were people with like what were regarded as serious felony convictions, just to be clear, none of them were won in the immigration system. They were all won some other way, a pardon or like a prosecutorial discretion from post-conviction relief rather, sorry. And so I just think like there's a lot of creativity in these squares, but there's more than us, right? Like we've really tried to figure out how to win, I think, some really impossible fights in the face of a lot of resistance, and then we've also lost too. So it's like, but this is part of the goal of this webinar really was to do that thing, Jacinta, that you said, is like just to learn about the history, like maybe based on where you're located, to think about what's happened there before, what infrastructure exists for people. In New York, there's a very large infrastructure of people to support on things like this, and other cities there aren't, right? But I think um I think we can, I just want to be cognizant that we're at the hour. I don't know if we wanted to maybe take, if people want to hang on and listen to maybe another question. I know the panelists have offered to stay on. So Chris?
Yeah, and there is a question. Yes, there is a recording, and so folks will be able to get access to that in the future. One question was, can smaller CBOs make sure they are keeping their data and their clients safe aside from a secure CRM tool or app? Like, can ICE ever demand from us to share client information?
ICE already has a lot of tools to get information about people. You know, I'm sure people know that there's social media packets, right, that show up. If there's personal and private information that you're sharing on social media, you can be sure that law enforcement and ICE is taking it and extracting it. And now they're also buying it. So what does it mean to have a strong CRM? I think it really means more about like, how do you can you engage in data protective practices? Sure. Can you oppose or just not obey a subpoena? Absolutely. And it really just depends on the context of the legal action that DHS is moving in. In deportation proceedings, they ask for all types of things. And it is sometimes a question about what you're going to provide and what you're not going to provide that will make a difference. Otherwise, you know, I think there's no one size fits all like protection policy for data. I think there's lots of though good defense guides that we can point you to that we're happy to share later on.
And the one thing I would just add to this, and I think everything you said is right, Paromita, you know, one of like many of you or groups that you're part of might be in like this scenario planning phase. And just one of the things that I know that has come up repeatedly in scenario planning, at least for us, has been attacks on organizations. We've particularly seen it, for example, Governor Abbott in Texas, because all these evil characters, y'all know they talk to each other, right? So like if we're looking at what's going on in Texas and how Governor Abbott has really use the system to go after organizations, and particularly organizations that are offering services along the border that are really helping folks that are recently coming in. There just should be plans that organizations should put in place to be able to make sure that your files, like your office space, all of those things are protected, and really watch what it is that you're keeping, just in case things do sort of go in that direction. And that's obviously something that, you know, can be a down the line thing. It doesn't have to be a scenario planning that folks are going into right now. But if we are looking at a Trump round 2, it is something that can be really helpful, because usually what happens is a crisis happens, and what do? We pick up the phone and we call the other person and we tell them everything. We're like, shoot, the police came in and I think they're gonna go to the cabinet where I have the thing hidden, and what do I do about that? And turns out, if that's the scenario you're in, you might have your phone tapped at that point. So just having some protocols in place at that point can be helpful. And again, we'll probably do another webinar about how to do that at some other time, but that just is something that has come up for organizations too, in terms of keeping yourself and your organization safe, but also your people's information that you keep in your office.
Thank you. So we'll ask the last question. Thanks everyone for tuning in today and for all the questions. So for the last one, and this is open to anyone, can you talk about how to use raids versus enforcement activity? How y'all recommend that folks use those different types of activity?
I personally always say raid. Some folks will say like, no, that's confusing. It's only if it's after a certain number, but there's something about the language that ICE uses, for example, enforcement activity, that seems so sterile and like it's just something that has to happen for public safety. That seems so sterile that it kind of really takes away the feeling, right, of you're in a police raid. Like there is no other way to talk about it. So ICE likes to pretend like they're not police, like they're special Department of Homeland Security. Like all of these language things matter. And so the more that I feel like we can actually bring it back to people to understand the violence and the intensity of it, whether it's one person getting picked up or 500 to me is important.
I agree, 1,000%. I think, part of the idea of challenging the idea of enforcement is because if you use enforcement, you're legitimizing the law that it actually is enforcing. And so part of our practice has been to always call it a raid, but also at the same time to delegitimize not only ICE police, but the laws that they are in place to protect. And so I think I agree, especially in this moment where we always get really stuck in the immigration space of like, this is a civil, right? It's like civil enforcement activity, meaning that these people have less protections. And so they're able to weaponize and use words to their advantage very well, and we have to combat that. Um, so thank you so much. Oh, Paramita, did you want to say anything on this before we wrap up? No, you're good. Okay. Well, thank you so much. Thank you to the panelists, good friends, and in the struggle, and for all of you for attending today. For Chris for your support with the Q&A, and to the interpreter, Chris. Thank you so much. So we look forward to seeing you all in the streets, as they say. Take care.
Thank you.